and we are addressing one time per month a different topic in sustainability. So to introduce ourselves real quickly, I'm Thoumsin. I work in the coffee department as a quality specialist, and I will let Meredith introduce herself right now.
Hi, I'm Meredith Taylor, and I am the sustainability manager for Counterculture.
Yeah, so we'd like to engage with our viewers here about some common questions that we received about different topics. Last month we talked about organic certification versus non-organic certification. And if you missed that, you can go to our website at counterculturecoffee.com/blog. Now, this month's topic is going to be climate change, which is no small thing. We've probably been hearing the words a lot. So Meredith, can you remind us what climate change is?
Sure. So to try to keep it short and sweet, global warming refers to a general increase in temperatures around the world. Climate change is a little bit broader. It's change in temperature, but also change in weather patterns. So things like strength and timing of winds, especially strength and timing of precipitation, those kind of things, those patterns fall into our understanding of what climate change is.
Okay. And so how does climate change affect coffee, since we are in this industry altogether?
Yes. So coffee is the seed of a fruit, and the fruit grows on a tree, and the tree stays in its spot for 30 plus years. So the piece of land, so in other words, the tree's kind of stuck on that piece of land. Coffee can grow a lot of places, but it only produces high quality beans under really specific conditions. So it's a kind of a sensitive plant. And so, it's also on a plant that's usually on a yearly cycle. So weather patterns, climate patterns are super important to letting the coffee tree know when it's time to flower, letting it know when it's time to grow beans. And so you can imagine that when things like rain patterns change, it really affects the plant, the biology of that plant.
Sure.
Another part of it is because the trees are in the same spot for a long time, if the climate changes on that particular side of the mountain, there's nowhere else for the coffee to go. So one of the problems or concerns with coffee is that the land that's suitable to grow coffee is predicted to decrease by about 50%. By 2050. So we're actually losing land that is suitable for growing coffee. There's only so far you can go up the mountain.
Correct. Yeah, and I imagine some things like varieties and stuff have a harder time growing in the areas where they once did, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, possibly. But what effects have we already seen from climate change in some of the areas where we purchase coffee from?
Yeah, so you might have heard of a disease called Roya. It kind of started in Southern America and has swept through Latin America in the last few years. It's a fungus, but the point is that it's largely attributable, or has largely been attributed to climate change. Changing climatic conditions have really allowed this fungus to thrive, and it has cut people's production and cut coffee quality as it kind of has moved through the country. Another example, like I said, coffee tree is really dependent on weather patterns to know what to do when. And so if the coffee is flowering and it rains really hard and knocks off those flowers, that means that coffee beans won't grow in that spot on the tree. So you can imagine a really hard rain can really devastate the production on a particular farm if that happens at the wrong time.
Recently, were there any regions that specifically were hit with these particular issues, like coffee leaf rust, for example? Yeah,
leaf rust kind of started in South America, and it's just now, I wouldn't say it's gone. It's not gone anywhere, but it's getting a lot better. Mexico was kind of the last spot for it, if you will. Guatemala and El Salvador, Nicaragua particularly had a hard time with Roya.
Yeah, for sure. So what does all this mean for coffee farmers?
So about 125 million people around the world make their livelihoods from coffee, which is a lot.
Yes.
And of that, about 25 million of them are smallholder farmers. So people that just grow coffee on small plots of land. But those people collectively actually make up about 80% of the coffee that we consume. So it's pretty hard when you depend on coffee for your livelihood, and a hard rain knocks off half of your cherries for the year, that means that, you know, you're going to get paid half as much as you did the year before. So you can imagine when things like that happen, it's really, really, it's hard. It's hard for coffee farmers. And the places where coffee grows, coffee is usually the primary driver of the economy in that town and also in that region. So if something happens within that region, it can really not just affect one farmer or one farm, but really the whole area.
Sure. Yeah, I have a question.
We have a question on Instagram from Help by Caroline. She wants to know your thoughts on producing coffee beans in an old warehouse or a controlled environment, like how microgreens are grown.
So speaking, I'm kind of hearing that as more of like a hothouse style / greenhouse situation instead of outside in the world. Meredith, thoughts on that?
I think from a scientific point of view, I think it's possible. I don't think it's probable. Coffee needs a lot of space. And again, we depend on these 25 million people around the world to grow most of our coffee. So we can't, all of that, translating all of that land indoors is not super going to work. And also, you know, it's important to, we're talking mostly about climate change adaptation and what farmers can do to adapt and how we can help through that. But it's important to remember the other side of the equation, which is what's causing climate change in the first place.
Sure.
And then there's usually a pretty big disparity between the countries that consume coffee, generally have the highest carbon emissions, versus coffees that produce coffees in countries where coffee is produced. You know, they are usually not the ones producing the carbon emissions. So switching to a system where everything's grown inside, for example, just makes me think of how much energy that would use and how many more, you know, how much more carbon that would put in the atmosphere, which is not really going to help the problem in the long run.
Okay.
Cool. So we have another question.
Another question
From Pacific NW Coffee. Wants to know, if rainfall does affect coffee farms, then what precautions do you take to prevent or counteract the rainfall?
That's a very good question.
Yeah, so, you know, farming in general is hard because there are just some things that are always going to be out of the farmer's control. And rainfall is one of them. What I have seen anecdotally is more trees, more shade cover kind of helps some of the, especially if it's hard rain, kind of prevents it from knocking the cherries or the flowers off the tree. So that's one thing. Otherwise, there's not much you can do while the coffee's on the tree.
True. So there's a lot of factors going on, obviously. We see some producers trying to grow some things in kind of greenhouse situations, but they're super small lots, scalable. It doesn't make like a whole lot of sense right now. And rain is a thing, you know, like Kenya went through some really bad droughts last year, and so their harvest suffered from that because of climate change, so it can work both ways. So what are we doing as counterculture coffee to work on this with the rest of the coffee industry around the world?
Yeah, so I think it's important to say, like, why are we working on this? You know, and I think it's because of the way we buy coffee, our sourcing model. We try to buy as much coffee as we can through long-term partnerships, and so we're invested in, you know, the people that we buy coffee from now, and, you know, where it's growing. We want to be able to buy it in 10 or 15 years. It's not a fungible commodity for us. So, you know, we're interested because we want to see that people we're working with, we want to be able to continue working with them. So, you know, it's hard thinking about our role. We're not scientists, we're not agronomists, and so we're not always in the best place to give technical advice. There are plenty of people who are, but I think a really important role that we can play is a connector. So, you know, we visit farms all around the world, we see what's happening, we see what practices people are taking to adapt, and as we travel to other farms, we can share that information. We're also, there's a lot of larger industry-wide initiatives going on around climate change, which is really exciting, and we're definitely taking part in those efforts because, you know, no matter what we do, us as one company isn't going to solve the issue, so it's really important to work collectively as well. I think the most exciting thing that we're doing is for the past few years, we have been working with a professor at Duke University, which we are here with in Durham, at the Nicholas School of the Environment, and working with her and several groups of master's students to really study how climate change is impacting farmers in different places. Because one of the really tricky things is it's not the effects and the impacts are not universal. So not only, and so that means that the answer or the solutions are not universal either. And so, you know, the other part of it is recognizing that while there is some scientific data about what's going to happen to the climate in a particular place 50 years from now, we don't need that level of data to let us know what's happening now. Right. Farmers pay attention to the weather. You know, they know what's happening. And so kind of our research has really centered around how can we take what farmers already know and are already experiencing and help them figure out the best adaptation solutions. So we did some work with this professor and these groups of master students to study how climate change is impacting a few of the co-ops that we buy from. And then the second round was kind of what are some feasible solutions that they could implement, because there's no shortage of ideas for solutions. Right. The problem is that what's going to work in a particular place really depends on the resources that that farmer or that co-op has. Okay. So solar dryers are an example of an adaptation solution. So kind of like think about a greenhouse type structure, but you're drying coffee in it. Mm-hmm. Great idea if it's raining when you're supposed to or trying to dry coffee, but not a great idea if your land is really steep and so you can't actually build a structure like that. So that's a good example of what's a good adaptation strategy might not work in every place.
Right. So you did a trial version of this workshop in Peru recently,
yeah.
in which you gathered a bunch of data from a lot of producers. And what was the number one thing for them did you discover with them that they could use more resources on to like do anti-climate change work?
Yeah, so we took this, a few years of data of research through Duke, and we tried to turn it into a 2 to 3 day workshop. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if we want to do this with everyone that we buy coffee from, and we do, we can't do a 3-year project with every co-op. We want to act faster than that. So we try to put together these workshops that lead groups of farmers through this idea of like, what's happening to you? What are some possible solutions? Of those, what are the most feasible, and then kind of try to help them narrow it down. So we did a beta test of this workshop this summer in Chirinos, Peru, with a partner called Twin Trading, actually a co-op that they buy from. And the thing that was probably the most interesting to me or the most validating is that we didn't teach them anything. They already, like I said, farmers know what's happening. They pay very close attention to the weather. They know what resources are available for them to try to adapt. Mm-hmm. And so, I think they came in, a lot of times farmers get training. So they come in and they learn, they take notes. Everyone came into the workshop prepared to like take notes, and I'm like, no, sorry, this is you guys are going to tell us. We're going to lead you through some exercises, and it'll help you determine what's the most feasible adaptation strategy for you in this place, in this organization.
So what was that for them?
For them, that was increasing their organic fertilizer production. They were doing it on a small scale as a co-op, and they decided they can really expand that to add nutrients to the soil that are getting washed away by erosion or other various things.
That's really exciting. We have a question.
We do. Carl Norman on Instagram wants to know, are there coffee farming practices that help offset carbon footprint of production?
That's a great question, and that was one we were going to address too, so thank you.
Yeah, so organic coffee farming, it is definitely produces fewer carbon emissions than coffee farming that uses a lot of nitrogen-based fertilizers. So in general, in the whole coffee supply chain, the consuming end usually, is responsible for much more of that coffee's carbon footprint than the producing side. But that can get skewed if the farmer is using a lot of nitrogen-based fertilizers. So on that part of it, don't use those. or use less of those. But there are also some really cool projects going on, especially with reforestation and avoided deforestation, where farmers are starting to get paid for carbon offset credits. So that's actually how we offset our carbon footprint here. We work with an organization who works with farmers in Chiapas and Oaxaca, Mexico, to set up carbon credits on their land for the trees that they plant and the trees that they preserve.
When did that start happening? Do you know, like year-wise? I'm excited to see the data. Is what I'm.
It's only in the past few years.
Okay, so we should have some more like solid data in the next couple of years.
Yeah, we would really hope to be able to do that with. Those are coffee farmers, but they're not coffee farmers we buy from. So eventually, we'd really like to bring it within our own supply chain.
Yeah, using those models and expanding with what we already know. Yeah, very good. Yes, another question.
Yes, Tyson Matthews wants to know, how do the recent changes to the EPA affect or concern coffee farmers and producers, if any?
Recent changes to the EPA.
Yeah. So this actually came up in Peru, which was so interesting to me. The farmers at the end of the workshop, we were kind of reflecting on how it went, and they were like, do people in the US know what's happening to us? And do they care? And, with the US policies on climate kind of shifting in a challenging direction right now, they were like, they seem really down about that.
Yeah.
And it's true, it can be really frustrating. But I think, for me, our answer is that's not the only way that things get done. So, we're a company and we can and are doing a lot, which has nothing to do with, EPA regulations. And we are by far not the only ones in coffee working on this issue. We have a lot of peer companies who are as well. So, I think at this point, it's on businesses to kind of take the lead in the policy sense.
Yeah, for sure. So we're working on some pretty cool workshop and things like that, but industry-wide, what else is going on about climate change? What kind of research is happening? Who's getting together with their resources to build new things?
So the good news is that there's a lot of academic research about climate change and what's predicted to happen. And so there's kind of no shortage of information, and sometimes it can actually be a little too much information for a co-op, for example, to decide, oh my God, what do we do with all of this information? Which is kind of another place where the workshop steps in. But there is a definite recognition in the coffee industry that climate change is a global problem, and we are only gonna, it's not something that exists only within one or two of our supply chains. It's everywhere. It crosses country boundaries. It crosses cooperative boundaries, and we're never going to solve it if we work on it in isolation. So there's a lot of initiatives going on that are kind of based around this idea of collective action. So, we, for example, we're on a group called the Coalition for Coffee Communities with Starbucks and Keurig Green Mountain, Farmer Brothers, S&D, some of our competitors, but we realize that issues like climate change are pretty competitive. So if we want there to be coffee in 20 years as an industry, we've got to work together on it. I think so there's a few of those things going on through Specialty Coffee Association and the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. There's also a really interesting coffee-specific organization called WCR, World Coffee Research. And they really focus on varieties. So coffee has lots of different varieties, and some of those are better adapted to changing climate conditions than others. So they are working on that question of what are the best varieties to grow where.
Right. And that takes some time because coffee takes quite some time to grow before it actually produces fruit, like usually between 3 and 5 years. Yeah, depending on the variety and all those other things. So you got to get a head start on planting and preparing for hotter weather.
Yeah, so we want to act fast, but we are a little bit limited in stuff like our variety trials because we just got to wait.
Just got to wait and see what happens.
Mary asked for the name of the coalition again.
It's the Coalition for Coffee Communities.
Very cool. So I guess one of our final questions is, what can the consumer, so you all who love our coffee, what can they do in order to address climate change and hopefully add a positive, good thing to it instead of making it worse?
Yeah. So I think that, you know, you can mitigate your own footprint. We actually just posted a blog post, I think last week, about 5 ways to brew your coffee more sustainably.
It's on the blog.
And actually brewing coffee, I think more in a cafe setting, but in general is the biggest part of coffee's carbon footprint. So that the most you can do in changing your brewing setup or being more efficient in that sense is definitely a good action to take. I think the other thing is just kind of doing some homework on different coffee companies and learning what they're doing about climate change and supporting those companies.
Yeah. And there are a few resources like World Coffee Research. You can look them up online. You can check out some of the more interesting things and variety-wise that they're doing. So this is like supposed to be a general conversation about that, but that well is deep if you want to really nerd out on it. Any other questions or thoughts?
Well, I did just want to add that we are really excited because we are going to do the second climate change workshop in 2 weeks from now in Guatemala with a partner. Their farm is called Finca Nueva Armenia. They have been partners for a super long time, 10 plus years.
Yeah.
So you might have seen their coffee if you're a long time customer. They, for specialty coffee, they have kind of relatively low elevation, and they don't have any place to move up the mountain anymore. So it'll be really interesting doing the climate change workshop with them and trying to figure out what adaptation strategies might work best there.
Yeah, for sure. We have a Facebook Live question from Diego. I'll go ahead and read it out loud because you on Instagram can't see it. Many arguments against adapting to climate change center around how those adaptations make no fiscal sense. Can you name some examples of adaptations to a changing climate that also make good fiscal sense? Yeah,
so adaptation is kind of, there's a short game and a long game. So the short game is, can a coffee producer continue to produce the same level of quality in the next 3 to 5 years by changing agricultural practices? And the long game is kind of, if that land that they're on is going to become unsuitable for growing coffee, can they transition to something else for their livelihood? So the issue is that a lot of these adaptation strategies take some upfront investment, and that's not something that coffee farmers always have. There's a definite issue in the industry with access to credit, and I would say that's probably the biggest roadblock right now for us as an industry is figuring out. It's one thing to know what you want to do to adapt, and it's another thing to finance it. But I would also say that long-term partnerships play a role there too. So if a farmer knows that we still want to buy their coffee 10 years from now, then they feel safer investing in it now. Whereas investing in it now and thinking, I wonder if someone's going to want to buy my coffee in 10 years makes it a lot riskier of an investment.
But that kind of backs up on our purchasing principles, which maybe we'll talk about more later. But, in it for the long run, not the short term. Absolutely. Good. Anyone have any last questions? Last call. This has been really insightful. Climate change is real. It's happening.
Yeah.
Big time.
It's happening, but, there are a lot of things that we can do about it as a company. There's a lot of things that we can do about it as an industry, and everyone has their own role to play. So we'll keep you guys updated, and we'll let you know how it goes at Finca Nueva Armenia.
Yeah, and this will be up on Instagram Live for the next day, correct? And you can also see a little bit of a snapshot of what we talked about on our blog once again. So search counterculturecoffee.com/blog. Thank you, Meredith, for all your sustainability information, and we're going to sign out now.
We'll see you guys next month.
Cheers.